The hallway was alive with chatter, lockers slamming, wrappers crinkling as wealthier children unwrapped lunches packed with care. But at the far end, a thin girl clutched her books tighter, pretending not to notice the emptiness in her stomach. Her smile was brittle, a mask against the gnawing ache. From the shadows, the janitor moved quietly, his mop squeaking against the tiled floor. He saw what others missed, the untouched tray, the girl's downcast eyes. Without a word, he paused, reached into a brown paper bag and slipped a sandwich, neatly wrapped, into her trembling hands. She froze, startled. Their eyes met briefly, no pity, only quiet understanding. His look seemed to whisper, "Eat, but never feel small." The bell rang. The crowd surged forward. Yet in that fleeting exchange, a bond was born between the invisible man and the hungry child. The morning light spilled through the tall windows of the school, washing the halls in pale gold. Students hurried past in clusters, laughter ringing as sneakers slapped against polished tiles. Posters about achievement lined the walls, bright declarations of success that seemed to belong to everyone but him. The janitor moved slowly, broom in hand, shoulders bent, not only from age but from the years of being unseen. His uniform was faded, his shoes patched at the edges, and though he carried himself with quiet steadiness, to most he was nothing more than background noise. "Ellis, could you hurry with that floor?" a teacher barked, barely turning to look at him. "We've got visitors coming, try to make it look less dull." He nodded, as he always did, his silence mistaken for stupidity. They never asked if his back hurt from bending over 100 times a day, never noticed how carefully he wiped each desk, as though the wood itself deserved respect. At faculty luncheons, his presence was tolerated but not welcome. "Don't lean the mop there, it drips," one muttered. Another smirked. "If these floors were scrubbed half as fast as he eats his lunch, we'd shine like glass." Laughter followed, light to them but heavy to him. He let it pass. He always let it pass. In the cafeteria, children were crueler, their words raw and unfiltered. "Trash man," one boy shouted as Ellis carried a bin past their table. Another chimed in, "Careful, don't drop your sandwich, he might steal it." Their giggles rose in a wave, bouncing off his silence. He gripped the bin tighter and kept walking, his eyes lowered. Inside, he whispered to himself, "They don't know I once dreamed of being seen." Because long ago, he had studied late nights, scribbling notes under a dim lamp. Long ago, he had pictured himself teaching in a classroom, not scrubbing after one. But when responsibility came, when bills stacked higher than textbooks, those dreams had been traded for work that paid in wages but cost him visibility. In the staff lounge, voices drifted past him like wind. "Big game tonight?" a coach asked another. "Can't wait, I've got box seats." Ellis refilled the soap dispenser silently, the question never meant for him. No one asked where he was going after work. No one cared that his evenings were long walks down quiet streets where no one waved. At times, it felt as if the world itself had folded him into its shadows, his existence acknowledged only when something broke or spilled. Yet in the middle of all that disregard, there was one pair of eyes that saw him. The girl with the empty lunch tray never laughed at his shoes. She never joined the chorus of names. Instead, she watched him with eyes too old for her years, eyes carrying both gratitude and sorrow. The first time he had slipped food into her hands, she had hesitated. But soon she began to meet his gaze, at first shyly, then steadily. For her, he was not the mop man, he was the man who noticed. Sometimes when their paths crossed, she whispered, "Thank you." Just that. Small words, but they carried more weight than a dozen insults. They reminded him that he still mattered, at least to someone. When teachers dismissed him, he remembered her soft gratitude. When children laughed at his worn shoes, he thought of her smile after the first bite of bread. Each night, as he packed leftovers into his lunch pail, he did not see it as charity. He saw it as justice, a tiny way to balance the scales in a world that punished the powerless. His inner voice spoke gently, though he never said the words aloud. "You are not invisible, not to me. And if no one feeds your body, I will. If no one feeds your hope, I will try." At times, he wondered what it would feel like to be acknowledged, even just once. To have someone say his name without summoning him to clean a mess. To sit among the faculty not as a servant, but as a peer. But life had stripped him of those dreams long ago, and he had learned to carry dignity in silence. The world might never see him, but the girl did. And for him, that was enough. At the end of another long day, Ellis retreated to the small custodial closet, its air thick with the smell of bleach. He set down his mop, opened his lunch pail, and looked at the sandwich inside. Half-eaten, the bread slightly stale, he tore it carefully, wrapped half in brown paper, and set it aside. His hands, rough and calloused, worked with tenderness. Tomorrow, he knew the girl would be waiting. And tomorrow, as every day, he would give what he could. The school saw him as nobody, but in her eyes, he was somebody, someone who mattered. At lunch, the noise was deafening, trays clattering, forks scraping, voices rising in complaint. They gave us 2 nuggets instead of 3, one girl groaned, poking at her plate. Another wrinkled her nose. The milk tastes weird today. Their laughter rose, careless and full, but at the edge of the table sat a girl who said nothing. Her tray was empty except for a cup of water, her hands wrapped around it as though it could fool her stomach into silence. She lowered her eyes, pretending to study the cracks in the table. Hunger was easier to hide than shame. She had learned that early: never admit it, never let it show. Smile if you can, nod if you must, but do not let anyone see the truth. At home, the cupboards were bare. The refrigerator hummed, its shelves almost empty except for a jar of mustard and a half carton of eggs long past their date. Nights were the hardest. Her mother would stumble in from work, apron stained from the diner, fingers smelling of grease and dish soap. She tried to smile, tried to ask about school, but the exhaustion behind her eyes spoke louder than words. The girl often pretended she wasn't hungry so her mother wouldn't have to hear the truth. She remembered one night, crouched near the door, overhearing her mother's muffled sobs. Bills spread across the table like broken wings, the numbers dark and unforgiving. Rent, electricity, school fees, her mother whispered, her voice cracking. A photograph of the father who had left them years ago lay in the corner, the frame turned face down. She never asked about him anymore. Some absences are better left silent. In the mornings, breakfast was a slice of bread if they had it, sometimes nothing at all. She carried an empty lunch bag to school because walking through the gates without one felt like walking naked into judgment. Better an empty bag than none. Children noticed everything, and cruelty thrived on the smallest differences. She would unzip it carefully at the table, shuffle the paper inside, and pretend she wasn't hungry. Pretend she had already eaten. Pretend, always pretend. The cafeteria was the loudest place in her world. Laughter, shouts, the snap of plastic straws. Everywhere, abundance she couldn't touch. She sat among it like a shadow, invisible except to the ache gnawing at her stomach. Sometimes she chewed the edge of her pencil just to feel something against her teeth. And then there was him, the janitor. He never stared, never asked questions, never forced her to explain. The first time he simply walked by, his steps quiet, and set a paper-wrapped sandwich near her elbow. She froze, staring at it as though it might vanish if she blinked. When she looked up, he was already walking away, his mop leaning on his shoulder. The taste of that sandwich, plain bread, a slice of cheese, nothing fancy, was the best thing she had ever known. It filled her belly, but more than that, it softened the sharp edge of despair. It was proof that someone noticed, that she was not entirely invisible. Day after day, the ritual grew. Sometimes it was rice folded neatly into foil, sometimes half an apple, sometimes just a biscuit. It didn't matter what it was. Each meal was a lifeline, a whisper against the roar of hunger. She began to wait for it, though she never asked, never demanded. She learned to glance at the floor just in time to see the paper bag slide across the tiles toward her. Their eyes would meet for a heartbeat, and in that silence was something larger than food. Her mother never knew. The girl couldn't bring herself to say it. How do you explain that the janitor fed you when the world looked away? Instead, she carried the secret like a flame tucked close to her chest. It burned quietly, keeping her warm when the nights felt too long, when the cupboards mocked her with their emptiness. The other children complained, loud and careless. She listened, drinking water, chewing slowly, and told herself to wait. She had someone who saw her, someone who gave when no one else did. The janitor's small kindness became her anchor, proof that even in silence, compassion could exist. And though she was just a girl with an empty bag, She was not entirely empty anymore. Days folded into weeks, weeks into months, and what began as a single sandwich became a quiet ritual, so subtle that no one else noticed. In the noisy chaos of the cafeteria, amidst clattering trays and careless laughter, a paper bag or foil-wrapped parcel would appear on the edge of her table. Sometimes he left it on a chair, sometimes slid it beneath her open book. It was never spoken of. No words passed between them. Only the food, simple and unassuming, carried the message. Some days it was half a sandwich, edges soft, filled with tuna or cheese. Other days, a small container of rice and stew, steam still rising faintly as if warmth itself had been carried across the hall for her. Once there was a single cookie wrapped in tissue, crumbling at the edges but sweet beyond anything she had tasted in weeks. Another time, a boiled egg cut neatly in half, sprinkled with salt. Nothing extravagant, always leftovers, but to her, each was a feast. At first she ate quickly, hunched over, afraid someone might notice. But as the days went on, she began to slow down, to savor. She began to wait for it, her eyes flicking to the doorway until she saw him pushing his mop or carrying his bin. Their eyes would meet briefly, and he would nod just once as though to say, "It's here. It's yours." One afternoon, she folded a scrap of notebook paper and slid it where he would find it near the broom closet. In shaky handwriting, she wrote, "Best meal ever." The next day, she did it again. "Thank you." Small notes, only a few words each time, but they were her way of speaking back. He found them tucked under his mop handle, slipped into his lunch pail, sometimes resting on the top of his broom. He never said a word, but when no one was watching, he unfolded each one slowly, smoothing the creases with hands too used to scrubbing floors. He kept them in his pocket, close to his chest, carrying them as though they were treasures worth more than gold. On nights when loneliness pressed too heavy, he would take them out and read them again, whispering the words under his breath. To the world, he was invisible. To her, he was irreplaceable. And somewhere between the quiet giving and the shy thank yous, a bond grew strong, built not from conversation but from recognition. She saw him not as the janitor mocked in whispers, but as the man who gave without asking. He saw her not as the hungry child pretending to be fine, but as a soul worth feeding. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic declarations. Just food passed discreetly, notes folded small, glances exchanged across crowded rooms. Yet in those ordinary moments, something extraordinary lived. A trust, a shared secret, a silent promise that neither could put into words. "You are not alone, I see you." And though the world never paused to notice, for the two of them, those meals spoke louder than anything else. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual midday noise, trays clattering, chatter swelling into careless laughter, the smell of fried food heavy in the air. She sat at the edge, shoulders hunched, her tray lighter than most, trying not to notice the abundance on the tables around her. He approached as always, quiet, blending into the background like he had trained himself to do. In his hand, wrapped carefully in a paper napkin, was a piece of bread and a small portion he had saved. He slipped it toward her tray, the exchange as subtle as a glance, a ritual they both understood without needing words. She looked up with wide eyes, gratitude written all over her face, the unspoken bond warming her chest. But this time, someone else was watching. "Excuse me," a sharp voice sliced through the din. The cafeteria hushed, conversations pausing mid-sentence. A teacher stood nearby, her arms folded tightly across her chest, lips curled in disdain. Her eyes locked on the janitor, her tone dripping with condescension. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" The girl froze, panic rising in her throat. The janitor straightened slightly, his posture still deferential, hands rough and empty now, the napkin gone. He opened his mouth, but no words came. "Your job is floors, not charity," the teacher sneered, her voice pitched loud enough for others to hear. A few students giggled nervously, whispers spreading. "Are you handing out scraps like some back alley dealer? Do you think this is appropriate behavior for staff?" The girl's cheeks burned hot. Shame rushed over her, though she had done nothing wrong. She clutched her tray as though it might shield her from the stares now crawling over her. Her stomach twisted, not from hunger this time, but from humiliation. She wanted to explain, to cry out that he was the only one who noticed, the only one who cared. but her voice betrayed her, small and trapped in her chest. The janitor kept his head bowed, absorbing the scolding like an old wall absorbs rain. He did not argue, did not defend himself, did not reveal her hunger. To do so would mean exposing her pain to the room, a cruelty he could never commit. His silence was his shield for her, though it cost him his dignity in that moment. "Pathetic," the teacher muttered, her heels clicking against the tiles as she turned away. "If I catch you again, you'll be reported. Remember your place." Laughter followed in her wake, not loud but sharp like pebbles thrown against glass. A few students whispered, "Did you see that? The janitor sneaking food?" Another added cruelly, "Maybe he eats it first." The girl's eyes filled, her small hands trembling as she tried to hold her tray steady. The bread now felt like contraband, her gratitude twisted into something shameful. The janitor bent slightly, pretending to adjust the broom, leaning against the wall, pretending not to hear. But inside, the words cut deep. He had grown used to mockery, to invisibility, to being nothing more than a passing figure in gray. Yet to have his kindness turned into ridicule, to see the girl's eyes clouded with shame because of him, was a wound sharper than any insult. He whispered under his breath, too soft for anyone to hear, "They don't know, they'll never know." His fingers brushed the inside of his pocket where her little notes rested, folded treasures that had carried him through darker days. "Best meal ever," one had said in crooked letters. "Thank you," another had scrawled, smudged with hurried ink. Those notes were proof that what he gave mattered, even if the world mocked him for it. The girl dared to glance at him as he turned to leave, his shoulders slightly more stooped than usual. She wanted to run after him, to tell him she wasn't ashamed, that she was only hurt by the cruelty of others. But fear pinned her down. All she managed was the faintest whisper, lost in the cafeteria's noise. "Thank you." He didn't hear it. Or maybe he did, carried in some quiet corner of his heart where words unspoken still lived. The narrator's voice settled like a low tide over the scene. The world often misjudges the hands that give. What some see as weakness is often the strongest form of love. And sometimes, the kindest acts are the ones most punished. The cafeteria roared back to life, students returning to their meals, teachers resuming their chatter. To them, it was just another small incident already fading from memory. But for the janitor and the girl, it was a scar, shared in silence, carried in secret, deepening the bond that no ridicule could erase. The hallway felt longer that day, every second stretched thin by hope. She sat on the cold bench outside the cafeteria, her empty tray balanced on her knees. For weeks, she had waited here at the same time, knowing a quiet hand would pass by, leaving behind a wrapped bundle of kindness. But today the minutes dragged into silence. No footsteps, no napkin-covered treasure. Just the echo of laughter from the cafeteria beyond the doors, a noise that suddenly felt crueler than usual. She pressed her lips together, willing the tears not to fall. Maybe he was late. Maybe he had been caught up with work. She told herself these lies until the bell rang, until students filed past her, chattering about desserts in seconds, their trays still half full. Still, he did not come. That evening, she searched, past the classrooms, past the offices, past the stairwell where the smell of bleach lingered faintly. She finally found him in a dim hallway of another wing, pushing his cart with tired arms. His uniform looked heavier, dustier. His smile, when he saw her, was small and weighted with something unspoken. "They moved me here," he said quietly, his voice rough but gentle as always. "Different wing, different schedule." Her chest tightened, words tumbling out in a whisper. "But what about lunch?" For a moment, his eyes softened, sorrow hidden behind the lines of endurance etched on his face. He reached into his pocket, not for food this time, but for one of her little notes, creased, faded, but kept close. He held it as though it were enough to explain everything. Then he bent slightly, lowering his voice to something only she could hear. "Study hard," he whispered. "Don't waste your hunger." The weight of those words pressed deeper than any meal ever had. She nodded, though her vision blurred, her throat closing tight. He turned back to his cart, hands steady, steps slow. She stood there, clutching her tray to her chest, as though holding onto the ritual that was now gone. The hallway swallowed him, his figure fading into shadow. And for the first time, the silence between them felt unbearable. Years stretched like corridors, each lined with shadows of memory. The girl grew taller, her hair longer, her voice steadier. But the hunger never fully left her. Not the hunger of the stomach, but the deeper one, the ache for more, for better, for a life her mother's weary hands and the janitor's quiet kindness had told her was possible. At night, she studied under the dim light of a flickering bulb, the edges of her books curling with use. Whenever fatigue threatened to drag her into despair, she would hear his voice again, quiet but insistent. "Study hard, don't waste your hunger." Those words became her fuel, sharper than coffee, steadier than rest. Years later, a graduation stage. She clutched a rolled diploma, her scholarship pinned like a small badge of victory. Her mother wept in the audience, pride and exhaustion mingling in her tears. The girl smiled, though her heart longed for one missing figure, the man who had once placed sandwiches in her hands. She scanned the crowd, but of course he was not there. He belonged to a different world, a different story. College was no easier. Nights blurred into mornings as she juggled textbooks with part-time jobs, washing dishes, folding laundry, scrubbing tables until her fingers cracked. Some days she barely ate, the irony bitter on her tongue. But always that whisper returned, "Don't waste your hunger." And so she didn't. Each obstacle became a rung on a ladder she was determined to climb. Professors doubted her at first, dismissing the girl from the underfunded high school. Employers overlooked her. She learned to endure, to sharpen her edges quietly, to prove herself in silence. Montage, a library where she fell asleep face first on open notes. A kitchen where she worked until dawn, wiping sweat from her brow. A classroom where her hand was the only one raised. Piece by piece, she built herself, not out of privilege, not out of luck, but out of persistence and memory. And through it all, the echo of those paper-wrapped meals lingered. They were not just food, they were proof that someone once had seen her. Proof that kindness was a form of recognition. One winter night, as snow fell softly outside her dorm, she wrote in her journal, "Someday I will stand where he could not. Someday I will feed others the way he fed me." Her vow was not loud, not grand, but steady, like his footsteps had once been in the halls. Time passed, seasons changed. The girl was no longer a girl, but a woman. The hunger remained, but now it had been forged into fire. A fire that was waiting, quietly, patiently, for its moment to rise. The theater pulsed with anticipation. Velvet seats filled with dignitaries, professors, and polished executives. The glow of chandeliers spilled over the audience like liquid gold. Murmurs rippled across the hall, waiting for the evening's keynote speaker. A woman whose name now carried weight, a name printed on banners, on the programs clutched in eager hands. Backstage, she stood still for a moment, her palms resting lightly against the wood of the podium before stepping out. Her reflection in the wing mirror caught her off guard. The sleek dress, the poised hair, the calm eyes. She almost didn't recognize herself. The announcer's voice thundered, "Please welcome." Applause erupted, echoing against the rafters. She inhaled slowly and walked into the light. The stage was vast, the lights warm against her face. But as her heels clicked across the polished floor, her mind flickered back to a different floor, scuffed tiles, faint smell of bleach, echoes of laughter that had once excluded her. Once she had been a girl with an empty tray. Now her voice was strong enough to silence 1,000 whispers. The hall quieted. She looked out, rows upon rows of expectant faces blurred by the brilliance of the spotlight. Yet she wasn't searching for applause. She wasn't searching for validation. Her eyes swept across the room, steady but urgent, as though hoping, against reason, that one weathered face, one pair of kind eyes might be hidden somewhere among the strangers. Her voice began, calm but resonant. There was a time when silence was my only companion. A time when hunger lived in me, not only for food, but for hope. Tonight, I want to share a story not about myself, but about someone unseen. Gasps rose gently from the audience. A story, they thought, but not the kind they had expected. The narrator's voice overlays. Once hungry in silence, now her voice fills a hall. But even now, her heart scans the crowd, not for the applause that thunders, but for the quiet presence that once saved her. She steadied herself, fingers brushing the edge of the lectern. The applause had already faded, but her pulse quickened. Because tonight, this stage was not hers alone. It was his. The man who once bent low to slide a sandwich into a trembling hand. The man whose footsteps had echoed softly in forgotten hallways. And though the years had stretched wide, though the world had moved on, she carried him here into this light. The curtains had risen not just on her triumph, but on his legacy. Her voice carried steady across the hall, but her eyes kept drifting, searching. Row after row, face after face, until in the farthest shadows of the back she froze. There he was. Older now, hair streaked with gray, shoulders stooped, his hands folded over the brim of a worn cap resting in his lap. His uniform was gone, replaced by a plain jacket, but she knew him instantly. The same quiet gaze, steady as ever. The world around her blurred, the chandeliers, the polished marble, the expectant faces. She saw only him. Her throat tightened, her rehearsed speech crumbling like dust in her mouth. She drew in a trembling breath. She stopped. The audience leaned forward, curious. Then her voice broke through, no longer the polished tone of a celebrated speaker, but the raw honesty of a once hungry child. I would not be here without a man no one saw. A ripple of confusion swept through the hall. She lifted her hand, gesturing toward the back row. There, she said, her voice thick. There he sits, the man who fed me when I was invisible, the man who gave me dignity when I had none. Gasps scattered like sparks. Heads turned. The spotlight swung from her, cutting across the hushed auditorium until it landed on him. He shifted uncomfortably, shrinking in his seat as though still trying to remain unseen. But it was too late. Silence fell heavy, reverent. 20 years collapsed into that moment. The whispers in the hallway, the paper-wrapped meals, the words that had carved themselves into her soul. Study hard. Don't waste your hunger. Her eyes glistened. His did too, though he quickly looked down, embarrassed by the sudden weight of attention. Yet for the first time, the world saw him. The silence shattered into thunder. Applause erupted, rising like a wave that swept across the grand hall. At first hesitant, then fierce, unrelenting. People stood one by one, then all at once, until the entire auditorium was on its feet, clapping not for the woman at the podium, but for the frail man in the back row. He shifted, startled, his weathered hands trembling against the brim of his cap. His eyes widened as the spotlight burned on him, not harsh but warm, a light he had never stood under before. For a lifetime he had cleaned quietly in the shadows, footsteps drowned beneath the noise of others. Now, for the first time, the noise was for him. Tears slipped down his cheeks. He shook his head slightly, as though refusing a crown he felt unworthy of. The woman on stage smiled through her own tears. Their eyes locked across the distance. She mouthed slowly, so only he could understand, "You gave me tomorrow." His lips trembled, forming a reply that carried no sound, only truth. "I only gave leftovers." The narrator's voice wove softly over the scene. For once, the world bowed to the hands that once carried scraps, and in that bow, the invisible man became visible. The applause did not fade quickly. It rolled on, echoing through marble and chandeliers, refusing to let him slip back into silence. And though his shoulders were still stooped, though his jacket was still plain, dignity draped him now like a robe of light. The girl he once fed stood tall on stage, not as a symbol of her own triumph, but as proof of his quiet legacy. And in that moment, both of them were seen. Some meals vanish in hours. Forgotten plates, empty wrappers, crumbs brushed away. But some meals linger for decades, feeding not the body but the soul. The night drew to a close, but the sound of applause seemed to cling to the walls long after hands had quieted. In the back row, the janitor remained seated, still overwhelmed by the sudden weight of being seen. He did not crave honor. He had never asked for gratitude. Yet tonight, the silence that once cloaked him had been lifted, replaced by recognition he had long believed would never come. On stage, the woman stood still, her heart swelling not with pride but with something deeper: completion. The circle had closed. She remembered every sandwich, every bowl of leftover rice, every stew carefully saved in a container meant for her hands alone. To others, scraps; to her, survival; to her, a promise that she mattered. The narrator's voice swept gently across the scene. Some greatness is loud, decorated with medals, names carved into stone. But there is another kind, the greatness that hides in plain sight, giving quietly, never expecting to be remembered. It is that greatness which builds the strongest bridges across time. She stepped down from the stage. The audience parted instinctively, eyes following her as she crossed the hall. She reached the back row, her heels slowing as she approached him. He tried to rise, fumbling with his cap, but she placed her hand over his, steadying him. No speeches, no spotlight now, just two lives bound by an old ritual of food and dignity. Together they walked toward the exit. The cameras did not chase them. The crowd watched in reverent silence. For a moment, it seemed as if the grand hall itself bowed, not to fame, not to power, but to the quiet truth of unseen kindness. The narrator returned, calm and measured. The world often overlooks the hands that carry scraps, the feet that tread in silence. Yet sometimes those hands leave behind more than crumbs. They leave behind futures. Sometimes the smallest gift plants the deepest root. As the doors closed behind them, the final image lingered. The celebrated woman and the humble janitor walking side by side. No longer giver and receiver. No longer invisible and seen. Just equals, sharing dignity earned in different ways, carrying a bond the world could never erase. The screen darkened, and a final whisper carried through. Greatness is not in what you keep, but in what you give unseen.